Welcome to our discussion of the Republic of Texas over the decade 1836 to 1846. I've divided this lecture into two parts, and this is the first part. First of all, let's look at the flag of the Republic of Texas. Going back to when Texas in the 1920s and early 1820s and early 1830s was part of Mexico. You'll recall it was part of the state of Coahuila y Tejas. And this is the flag of that Mexican state. And you'll notice it has two gold stars. Well, immediately after declaring independence, the Republic of Texas, now an independent country, adopted this flag for a few years, and it has the same one gold star and a blue background. And now this will look more familiar to all of you. This flag was adopted in 1836 until the end of the Republic in 1845. And of course, the same flag today is the flag of Texas. Now, why is there only one star? And as you probably know, Texas is known as the Lone Star State. Well, as we saw, there were two stars in the combined state of Coahuila y Tejas and Texas, and so immediately following independence, it certainly made sense to just use one star to indicate not only they were independent, they weren't an independent state within Mexico, they were rather an independent country. And at the time, it represented the solidarity of the Texans, both the Anglo settlers or the Texians and the Tejanos, their solidarity in declaring independence from Mexico. And today, that star represents Texas's independent spirit. Now, the flag also has a single red stripe and a single white stripe. Now, those come from the flag of the Fredonia Republic, which you recall in East Texas near Nacogdoches was a secessionist movement that seceded briefly from Mexico in 1826 and set up its own country. And the red and white stripes of that flag were to represent the alliance between the Anglo settlers there for the white stripe and the Native Americans and their heritage, which is the red stripe. Now, if you look at the current Texas flag code put out by the state of Texas, the star, quote, represents all of Texas and stands for unity as one for God, state, and country. The blue for loyalty, the red for bravery, and the white for purity. Now, many Texans are obviously proud of their flag. It's displayed all over the place in Texas, and very proud that they have the flag that goes back to the latter part of the independent country of Republic of Texas. Now, you may or may not have heard of the North American Vexiological Association. The word vexiology means those who do a scientific and systematic study of flags. And there's an international society, and this is the North American chapter, which looks at flags in the U.S. and Canada. About 10 years ago, they did a survey of all their members, and those members ranked Texas as having only the second most attractive flag. This was a real letdown, obviously, for Texans who were proud of being first in so many other things. In case you're wondering, this is the flag of the state of New Mexico. You may well have seen it on cars from New Mexico that drive through Texas, because this state flag is shown on their license plates. The red and yellow symbolizes Old Spain, those are Spanish flag colors, and the symbol in the center is the ancient Zia sun symbol. Now, over the 10-year period we're going to be looking at, we're going to see a huge, huge population increase in Texas. And you see in the two columns here an estimate from 1836, and that's what they are. They're not, 100% accurate. And then in the right column, actually after, in 1847, after Texas became a state, but this is also an estimate. So you look at the population of Anglos tripled from roughly 30,000 to 90,000. The population of slaves went up much, much faster, 5,000 to 40,000 slaves. And this, of course, reflects what will be seen: many people from the southern part of the United States moving to the independent Republic of Texas and bringing their slaves with them. As for the Hispanic population, there were 3,500, 1836, and more than 3 times that number, or 12,000 in 1847. There was a rough estimate of 15,000 Indians in 1836, and no count was made in 1847, although estimates are that there were somewhat fewer. Now, among the whites, there were roughly 8,000 of German descent, as many people from Germany came to central Texas, and we'll look at that in the next lecture. And the main attraction for Texas was the very cheap land. People coming from Germany, it was very cheap. People coming from other parts of the United States, it was cheap and available. So immediately after winning the Battle of San Jacinto, you will recall, as a prisoner, Santa Anna signed the Treaty of Velasco about a month after the actual battle. Now that ended the war and led to Texas independence, with the Rio Grande River as the southern boundary. Now, the traditional boundary of Texas, when it was part of Spanish North America, it was province of Spanish viceroyalty, headquartered in Mexico City, and as well as being a state under Mexico, the southern border of Texas was not the Rio Grande, but the Nueces River. Now, Santa Anna was a prisoner, and many in the Texas military wanted to execute him, and Sam Houston was firm on no, he must be allowed to live. And Sam Houston said something to the effect of, if he dies, he's just one more dead Mexican soldier. Alive, he is much more valuable to us. And certainly that was the case. By not killing him immediately, they got him to sign the Treaty of Velasco, and now the Texans wanted to use him to try and two things. One, to try and get President Andrew Jackson in Washington to try and to annex Texas as a state, and the other was for Santa Anna, who was, after all, the president of Mexico. He wasn't just another general. He wanted him to go back to Mexico City and convince the government officials there to accept the Treaty of Velasco. Well, the United States government did not immediately recognize Texas independence, and it certainly didn't try to annex Texas either as a territory or a state. The reason being, 1936 was an election year in the U.S. President Andrew Jackson was not running for re-election in 1936, and his fellow Democrat, Martin Van Buren, was the Democratic Party candidate. the whole issue of Texas independence from Mexico and the possibility of annexation to the U.S., either becoming a U.S. territory or directly a state. That was very, very controversial, largely for the issue of slavery. Texas, of course, was a slave state. And there was also the fear that since Mexico never really recognized the the independence of Texas, that could lead to a war with Mexico. And of course, this is exactly what happened. We'll see when the U.S. brought Texas in as a state. Now, this is a stamp from 1936 honoring the 100 years of Texas independence from Mexico. Of course, by this point, Texas is a state. And you have a drawing of the Alamo, and you have portraits of Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin. You'll notice that this was 3 cents. That's what it cost to mail a letter in 1936. Now it's 50, I forgot what it is, 52 or 55 cents, something like that. So there was an interim government after the Battle of San Jacinto. And then in September 1936, the Texas officials determined that there would be an election to set up a permanent government. And there were 3 candidates, Henry Smith, Stephen F. Austin, and Sam Houston. And there weren't any political parties at this time, so it was really more of a popularity contest among the 3 individuals. Now, Sam Houston won easily, and you might be surprised why Stephen F. Austin didn't win, because he, after all, had set up the first colony, had been instrumental in bringing people in. Well, among the people who'd been there a long time, he was popular, but the many, many people who had arrived, say after 1829, 1830, they didn't really know that much about him because there were other colonies. And also Sam Houston was the big hero of the war because he, of course, in the Battle of San Jacinto, had managed to defeat an element of the Mexican army. That certainly wasn't the entire Mexican army, but he had captured Santa Anna, and Santa Anna, as a prisoner, had signed the Treaty of Velasco. Of course, we'll see when Santa Anna gets back to Mexico City, he claims that he was forced to do it, he was under duress, and that Mexico should not honor the provisions of that treaty. Now, during the 1836 election, there were separate candidates for the president and vice president. And you'll recall from your studies of United States history, this was exactly the same in the United States in the first few elections. You could have a president of the United States who was from one party and the vice president from another party. And in fact, that's what happened. Well, here back in Texas, Sam Houston won the presidency, but when people voted for the vice president, they elected Mirabeau Lamar, who was a personal enemy of Sam Houston. But Lamar was well known. There was a lot of name recognition because of his courageous war record. Now, during the 1836 election, voters were also asked if the U.S. should join the United States. And 97% of the voters said yes. So obviously there was widespread sentiment in favor of joining the United States. So we'll talk first about Sam Houston. He was the first president of the Texas Republic, and the Constitution that was set up stipulated that the first president of the Texas Republic would only have a 2-year term. Subsequent presidents would have 3-year terms, and the first president couldn't be reelected. So Sam Houston was the first president for 2 years. And then, as we'll see, his vice president, whom he didn't like, was the second president. And then Sam Houston came back as the third president of the Republic. So the representatives, Lone Star Republic, quickly wrote a constitution, much of it very, very similar to the U.S. Constitution. It explicitly legalized slavery, and in fact, Section 9 of the Constitution guaranteed slavery forever, but it used the word forever. It also prohibited any free blacks from living in the state, in the country of Texas, because of course now it's an independent country. So if a slave owner wanted to free a black slave, let's say the slaveholder's 3-year-old son fell in a river and the slave jumped in and saved the kid's life, the slaveholder might be so grateful he could give the slave his liberty and perhaps his family. Well, if that was done, the slave and his family had to leave the country of Texas unless Congress allowed them to stay. And they also voted for annexation to the United States. Now, the Texans certainly wanted to become part of the United States, but the Congress refused. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, because they didn't want to add another slave state, there was a balance in the United States Senate with an equal number of slave and free states, and with each state having the same number of senators, 2 senators, there was a balance. So they didn't want to do that. And there were many, many people in the North, of course, who were very hostile to slavery, abolitionists, and they didn't want to have another slave state come in just for moral reasons. There was also widespread fear in the U.S. Congress that by bringing Texas into the United States, there'd be a war with Mexico, since it had never accepted Texas independence, because Santa Anna, when he got back to Mexico City, said he was a prisoner, been forced to sign the Treaty of Velasco, and came out and publicly said the treaty is not valid. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that the Treaty of Velasco established the southern border of Texas as the Rio Grande River. And you can see quite clearly in this map, the light green area is the area that's claimed by Texas. And it starts in the south at the Rio Grande. It follows the Rio Grande up. You can see the Big Bend there. It goes up, through the current state of New Mexico, and then goes up and up and up into Colorado, part of Colorado. And you can see it's much larger than the current state of Mexico. The Republic of Texas in the dark green would be using the traditional boundaries, if you will, of Texas with the southern border at the Nueces River. But Texans living in the Republic of Texas strongly maintain that both green areas were the independent country of Texas. I'll just show you here a few old maps. I don't know about all of you. I love looking at old maps. They're a lot of fun. Here you can see on the lower left the Lone Star flag. It says Republic of Texas, 1836. And you can see the state there. The southern boundary is the same as the southern boundary today. Clearly the Rio Grande River. It goes up. You can see the Big Bend. And then those are the mountains that go up into the Rocky Mountains. And you can see it goes way up there to part of Colorado and then comes down. It's much larger than the current state. What's interesting is if you look in the upper right-hand corner of the map, and where you can see a vertical, the border is a vertical line going north-south, where you can see a wagon train coming. And that's the famous Santa Fe Trail. You can if you squint, you can read it. Santa Fe Trail, and that's coming from Missouri. And then people would come on the Santa Fe Trail, and it would continue across. They would continue that red line across and into Santa Fe. So now this is the area that we just saw on that beautiful map. You can see in yellow the Republic of Texas boundaries according to the Texans. And you can see that it goes, this also has the current states boundaries in there. You can see on the left or on the west, New Mexico. So Texas claimed at least half of what's now New Mexico, a big chunk of Colorado up into Wyoming, a little bit of Kansas, and the edge of Oklahoma. This is another map. This is in 1845, before Texas is taken over by the United States. And you can see on the east of Texas all the states in the United States. In the north, you can see Iowa Territory and Wisconsin Territory, because that area had not yet been admitted to the United States. And then you can see Texas. This map has the Republic of Texas, exactly the same as the Texans claimed, going way up into Colorado. Above Texas, if you look at the panhandle just to the north, it says unorganized territory. This was territory of the United States of America, but it was unorganized. It was unorganized in the sense that it was not divided into even territories because there were hardly any people living there. And if you look there in the center, you can see those brown blobs. If you look carefully, those are buffalo. Those are buffalo, all in the Great Plains area. And to the left or the west of Texas, you can see all that says Mexico. And of course, that will be acquired by the United States after the war with Mexico, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. And then finally, if you look up in the northwestern part of the United States, where the states of Washington and Oregon are now, you can see it says United States and England, okay, because there was controversy over the United States and England in that region. So now let's look briefly at Sam Houston as the first president of the Republic. And as I mentioned before, this is a 2-year period, 1836 to 1838. Well, Mexico never accepted the independence of Texas. And Houston came right out as president, said he would protect Texas from Mexican threats if Mexico tries to take it back, as well as the Comanche, which were the most powerful and feared Indian group for the Texans. So as a first step, Houston sent a number of Texans with Santa Anna to Washington, D.C., and they hoped that Santa Anna could persuade Andrew Jackson to accept Texas independence. And Santa Anna wrote in his letters that he was very politely received by President Andrew Jackson, but Jackson did not move immediately for Texas to become part of the United States because of the situation I described before, widespread opposition to letting a slave state in. And now Houston and Santa Anna reached a deal that in addition to signing the Treaty of Velasco, they had a secret side agreement where Santa Anna agreed that he would be freed. He'd no longer be a prisoner if he went to Washington, D.C. to talk to President Jackson, and then went back to Mexico City to try and convince the Mexican government to accept the Treaty of Velasco. So Santa Anna signed that deal because the alternative was to be held indefinitely as a prisoner, and he knew very well that there were many people in Texas who would like to see him killed. So Santa Anna met with Jackson, and he returned to Mexico, in fact, on a U.S. Navy ship. As I mentioned before, he promised to urge the Mexican government well, he promised to urge the Mexican government to accept the Treaty of Velasco. And what he did, though, is he went and had them repudiate or renounce the Treaty of Velasco, and they resumed their hostility. So, okay, the Texas government had a real sticky point with Mexico. Was, first of all, Mexico said, "What's all of Texas belongs to Mexico," and they said also, "We do not accept your southern boundary at the Rio Grande River." Well, here it is, the end of 1836. The U.S. still hasn't recognized Texas as an independent country. Forget about becoming part of the U.S. Here's Texas, disorganized, a group of rebels. Not even the United States recognizes their independence. And the two main reasons: there was opposition in the United States Congress, and the public at large was, people were against having another slave. Many people in the North were against having a slave state coming in, and the fear of a war with Texas. Finally, the U.S. government recognized Texas in March 1837. In fact, on the very last day of his presidency, President Jackson formally recognized Texas as an independent country. Now, it's interesting, his successor as president, Martin Van Buren, served for 4 years and never even mentioned Texas during that 4-year period because it was so controversial. Well, now Texas had gotten recognition from the United States as an independent country, and it was tried to get recognition from its two most important European countries at this time, France and Britain, both of which imported much Texas cotton. And Sam Houston wanted France and Britain to recognize Texas because he was still worried Mexico might try and invade. Well, meanwhile, in 1837, the capital of Texas was moved to 4 or 5 different sites, and it was relocated to Houston at one point, and there were only just a few small buildings in Houston at that point. And the small city, you can't even really call it a city, the group of buildings, they called Houston in honor of Sam Houston. And of course, Sam Houston, being president, was delighted to have a city named after him. However, the delegates that came to Houston for the meetings complained constantly of the high heat and humidity for most of the year, many tropical diseases. Of course, at that time, they didn't know the role of mosquitoes in passing those diseases. And there was often flooding because Houston, what's now downtown, is right next to the Buffalo Bayou. For those of us who live in Houston, we can certainly understand the concerns with heat, humidity, and flooding. Fortunately, we don't have to really worry about tropical disease now in Houston. And I might note that in terms of heat and humidity here, the British government has a consulate in Houston. The consulate is a branch office of an embassy, the British Embassy, of course, in Washington, D.C. And the British diplomats at the consulate in Houston receive extra pay because Houston is considered a tropical post for them. Now, turning to the Indians, the frontier settlements experienced many raids from the Indians, primarily the Comanches, but also occasionally the Kiowa, and in eastern Texas, the Cherokee. Sam Houston himself favored peaceful coexistence with the Indians. He had run away from his family as a teenager and had actually lived with the Cherokees in the eastern part of the United States, in the Tennessee area, and he actually spoke some of their language. And later, after he had a failed marriage and he was bankrupt, he returned to the Cherokee tribe and lived with them. So he had a very positive experience with the Cherokees in the eastern part of the United States, and he felt it was perfectly possible for the Indians and the Anglos to live peacefully together. Because of his feelings, Houston submitted a treaty with the Cherokees to the Texas Senate, which rejected the treaty. And indeed, Sam Houston's own vice president, Lamar, had been urging the Texas senators to reject the treaty because Lamar wanted to take a very hard military line with the Indians, which we'll see he did once he became president. Well, the new country of Texas was desperate for funding. It didn't have the funds to pay the officials, the army, and it tried to obtain loans, but it couldn't obtain loans in the U.S. because of the economic panic in 1837. Thus far in this course, we've talked about several economic panics in the U.S., and there'll be several more as we move along in Texas history. This is the normal business cycle, panics. So Texas had no access to funds, and it had to pay the soldiers in the army, it had to pay officials, it had other essential expenses. So the very last resort, which they actually did, was issuing paper money. This paper money, we mean currency, the type you might keep in your wallet or purse, $5 bill, $10 bill. But it was not backed by anything. It wasn't backed by gold or silver. It had only the full faith and credit of the Texas government. Now, until the 1930s, all United States government currency was backed by gold. So until the 1930s, let's say the 1920s, you were beginning to lose faith in the economy of the U.S. You could take a $10 bill and go to a bank, and they would get for you $10 worth of gold. And these were, they would give you a bar of gold, but they give you, $10 gold coins. And originally, you recall from studying U.S. history, in the United States, they didn't have paper money. Everything was gold or silver, largely gold. But when a government or a country needs more money in circulation, what they start doing is issuing more and more paper money. All it costs to do is the piece of paper and to print it. And in the United States right now, since the 1930s, there is nothing backing up the U.S. currency other than exactly this phrase, the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. So you can't take a $10 bill and go down to your bank or the Federal Reserve System and say you want gold or silver. They'll say, sorry, because the United States government has issued much, much more paper currency than it has gold, even though, of course, it has a lot of gold at Fort Knox and elsewhere. So here we have the Republic of Texas. It's like a very poor developing country right now in the world, which needs money. So what do the governments do right now? They print money. They issue paper money as fast as they can print it. And of course, people say this is worthless. No one has any faith in it. Well, exactly the same thing happened to the Republic of Texas dollars. At first, they were issued on par with the U.S. dollar, which means one Texas dollar was the equivalent of one U.S. dollar. Well, but then there were so many Republic of Texas dollars being printed, the value fell, and this caused severe economic problems in the state. Okay, this is the last slide in part one. This is just a photo of a $50 Republic of Texas currency. And this is, and it says near the bottom, receivable for all government dues. So if you have these and you owe taxes to the Republic of Texas will take them. But if you go to your local store to buy something, people say, well, I'm not really sure that's worth $50. Don't you have any gold? Or revert to a barter economy. Start giving me, cotton or wheat or something else. Okay, this is the end of part one, and we'll proceed with part two. Thank you.